Yeah, yeah. Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm your host, Byron Pace. It is the 7th of December 2020, and today I'm joined by Dr. Richard Thomas. He is head of communications from an organization that you may not have heard of called Traffic, and they're really focused on the global wildlife trade. Their kind of mission statement, which comes from their executive director, Stephen Brood, reads, "We want to see a world where wildlife trade is sustainably managed, maintains healthy populations, contributes to development, and helps motivate commitments to conserve wild species and habitats." We dive into all of that in this show, and it's a little bit longer than usual, so I am not going to hold you up anymore in the intro, other than to direct you to a monthly column that I write on the Modern Huntsman website, which is modernhuntsman.com, called Into the Anthropocene, and we cover a lot of topics that are very similar to the kind of things that we're talking about in this podcast. So go over and check that out, and otherwise, buckle up and enjoy the show. Richard, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We're going to be talking about a really interesting organization that you are head of communications for, but it may be one that a lot of people haven't actually heard of. We talk a lot about global conservation on this show, and I think most people's minds when we talk about global conservation go to like biologists in the field looking at like genetic diversity of species or restoration of habitat. But Traffic has a real big focus on the actual trade, the legal and illegal trade of wildlife around the world. Can you explain to me how Traffic started and what does a day-to-day of the organization look like?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. So Traffic's origins actually, we were founded in 1976, and I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard of CITES. That's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and that came into being in 1975. And it's no coincidence that Traffic was formed shortly afterwards, because our original role was to help governments with implementing the new convention that was overseeing trade in wild animals and plants. We were originally formed by IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and the other.
Which has the famous red list that a lot of people
correct.
will be aware of. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure many of your listeners will have referred to those red lists. Absolutely invaluable source of accurate information on wild animals and plants. And the other partner when Traffic was created was WWF, who I'm sure is a household name to many of your listeners. But a few years ago, we became our own independent organisation. But prior to that, we were essentially the wildlife trade specialists and experts, providing information to IUCN for their red list information in particular, and to WWF, who are well known in the conservation field. When people talk about wildlife trade, their immediate thought is probably, if they're thinking about illegal trade, they think about ivory being trafficked.
Yeah, or pangolins
This kind of thing. But actually, they're a tiny fraction of the trade in wild animal and plant resources that are being traded worldwide. And if you do the breakdown, the biggest by far and away are timber resources, and they're something like 65% of all wild commodities that are in trade is timber. And this is followed by fisheries. And then an awful lot of trade is actually in so-called non-wood forest products, so things like nuts and berries and anything that comes out of a forest that's not timber. And then down at the bottom, you've got the actual wild animals that are traded, some of it legal, some of it illegal. The one that gets the highest profile, of course, is the illegal trade, because that's what the media tends to be most interested in and attracts the headlines.
Yeah, it's. I think that there, especially now with the heightened awareness of species like pangolin, which is often quoted as being the most illegally trafficked mammal on the planet, but also, like you rightly mentioned, rhino horn and ivory and some of the like rosewood in terms of timber. that illegal component of the trade, I think, has somewhat tainted a view of what wildlife trade is, with very much a public perception that wildlife product trade is very much a negative thing. What is the reality on the ground when it comes to trade? Because I understand from the information and investigations that traffic do, and from seeing different operations around the world, that there is a lot of positives to be taken from the regulated trade in wildlife products.
Well, absolutely. I mean, well-regulated trade can bring real benefits to uh, people who rely upon it for their livelihoods. Traders of particular plant species, or uh, even certain kinds of animals and so on. I mean, fish are eaten, a massively important source of protein for billions of people around the world. Well, of course, the um, economic benefits, are vital for national economies, things like timber exports and so on. But the critical thing is that any trade in these wild resources needs to be managed in a sustainable manner. And of course, it needs to be carried out legally, because the last thing we want to see happen is trade benefiting criminals who are carrying out any illegal activities. But don't underestimate the real positive value and importance to countless numbers of livelihoods and people around the world of sustainable legal trade. So it is something to be celebrated, and it is something to be encouraged. And traffic actually has an area of work on wild harvested plant products, and we work alongside something called the Fair Wild standard, which is uh, a certification standard. Now, I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard of fair trade.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. As you were describing this to me, I'm thinking like fair trade coffee.
Yeah, so fair trade is for cultivated products. So coffee is cultivated, whereas fair wild is almost the equivalent for wild source products. So if you go into your local supermarket now, you can see, if you look at packs of, for example, Puka herbs teas, if you look on there, you'll see a little logo that says Fair Wild certified ingredients on their licorice, which is sourced from Kazakhstan. And the Fair Wild certification means that the product in there was harvested. There's checks in place to make sure it's sourced sustainably, and there is a premium paid by the buyers and the to the producers of that product. And some of the money goes into a community fund that can be used to support the community that is producing the product. And we've examples of Fair Wild certified products from all around the world, actually. And increasingly, it's something that industry is buying into, and we're seeing more and more products with Fair Wild certified ingredients coming into the marketplace.
So how is that? Is that a system that has been implemented by Traffic, or who are your other global partners to help bring this and raise the awareness of it to people actually on the ground who would be harvesting these natural products anyway?
Well, it was originally developed, the actual Fair Wild standard upon which the certification scheme is based was originally developed by Traffic alongside specialists at IUCN and WWF. And then we took it to industry, and we got buy-in from Puka Herbs, as I mentioned, but big retailers like Traditional Medicinals in the United States. They've taken it up, and we've then used the model, if you like, to talk to local wild harvesters in places I don't know, some examples would be India, China, Vietnam, Southeast Europe, all over the place, who obviously are producing very different products, but the principles upon which they're harvested are the same. So that, first of all, we'll carry out an analysis of basically what levels of offtake are possible each year without negatively impacting the populations of the plants that are being harvested. And then we've helped local co-ops to be established, and also that's given them traction when talking to international buyers, that they're able to demonstrate that they've got sustainably harvested products, and that in turn attracts a premium price. And so there's benefits to the producers at the bottom rung of the trade chain.
Yeah, and I suppose that the hope here is that the more people who embrace this, and the more of these products that have this stamp on it, there's a smaller likelihood that you're going to have products coming into the market that are coming from unsustainable sources.
That's exactly the thinking behind it. And ultimately, what drives trade chains in any commodity is the demand by the consumers at the end point. So if consumers are looking for and asking for products that they know have been sustainably harvested, that in turn will feed down the trade chain and help drive the production systems towards the sustainable model.
Yeah, it's a really important point. It's a little bit like I think of, if not that I buy it very often anymore, but if I was to buy a tin of tuna, I'm always going to turn it around and make sure that it's caught from a sustainable source with, and it be pole caught, so that there's no chances of turtles and dolphins being caught in nets, which was very, very much part of the industry only a matter of years ago. I would imagine now probably most tuna on the shelves probably comes from sustainable sources and is pole and line caught. But it's a similar sort of thing. If us as consumers of whatever that product is care enough to check and look into how these products are sourced, then that demand will determine the supply.
Absolutely. I mean, consumer buying power, purchasing power is key to this, because ultimately that does decide industry policy.
With something you were just saying earlier about products going in, particularly for sort of traditional medicines, I think there's a view in the West in particular that Chinese traditional medicine, which we associate in particular with pangolin scales, and we associate with the use of rhino horns and ivory carving, is entirely negative. But from what you're saying just early on in our conversation, I would imagine it probably supports quite a considerable economic component of trade from various parts of the world, some of which will be legal and sustainable.
Yes, so there is rather a negative perception of a lot of traditional Chinese medicine in Western societies, but because of the parts from threatened and endangered species that are used in some of the prescriptions. But actually, the traditional Chinese medicine industry in China is very aware of this, and I think we should acknowledge the number of steps that have been taken to try and reduce the use, and indeed, on occasion, ban the use of some of the threatened animal parts. So just this year, pangolins were removed from the main body of the official Chinese pharmacopoeia. That's basically the list of medicines that are approved for use. It was many years ago that tiger parts were removed from that pharmacopoeia, and similarly rhino horn. And the traditional Chinese medicine is sometimes written off as being, not operated on the same sort of lines as Western medicine is. But let's not forget where this remarkable antimycin drug that treats malaria came from. That had a traditional Chinese medicine origin, where it had been used for centuries in the treatment of malaria, but it is now the sort of go-to drug for treatment for that disease. So I think there's a lot of positive things that have been done to try and ensure that the impact of traditional Chinese medicine remedies on threatened species is reduced. And in fact, a number of years ago now, Traffic actually worked with the biggest of the traditional Chinese medicine universities in China to produce a textbook where we proposed alternatives to using the parts of threatened species in those textbooks. And obviously those will now be working through the system as new students were coming into the universities and learning the application of traditional Chinese medicine through the courses that were run there.
Yeah, at the sort of start of the pandemic, which we're all still living through right now, when it came out that it had originated, or certainly the first infection in humans had originated in a wet market in China. There was a call some weeks after that, and a letter. I'm not sure if it was an open letter or if it was a call to CITES. I can't quite recall, which was suggesting a global ban in wildlife trade. I think it was almost as open as that. At the time, that seemed like an incredibly naive and very short-sighted statement with not a lot of understanding of what the global trade was. And yet there were scientists with their name on this letter.
Yeah, I think that was a sort of a gut reaction to perceiving the origins of SARS-CoV-2 and the associated COVID-19 disease having come from the trade of wild animals in this Wuhan market. I think it's, as you say, naive. I mean, I think just simply outright banning all trade is just going to push it underground. The key is demand. If demand persists, then trade will persist. So what we really need to do is try and get an understanding of where the virus, what its origins actually were, and if there are things within wildlife trade that are potentially risky, then to try and ensure that those practices aren't taking part. So things like, the mixing of particular species together may be very risky from a zoonotic disease perspective. That if you cram in, I don't know, a load of pigs and pangolins and what have you into a market, then that creates a very risky environment for that spillover event to happen, where a disease will make the jump from animals to people with potentially fatal impacts. But simply just banning things is just going to push it underground and potentially make the system more dangerous. That there would be less regulation because by its nature it is underground. So I think it's a very short-sighted and potentially risky approach, simply to just say ban everything. But we do really need to get to an understanding about where this particular disease really did originate, because subsequently the evidence certainly doesn't suggest that Wuhan market is the original source of the outbreak. It appears to be just a location from where the disease there was a small epicenter for a disease, but it was no more significant in some ways than a nightclub where a lot of people got the disease. It was just a location where a lot of people caught the virus, but where did the virus actually come from? And this is a really interesting question, and it's the WHO has been commissioned to go into China and try to get to the bottom of that. And it is absolutely critical to understanding. I mean, we do know from genetic studies that the ancestor of the virus originated in horseshoe bats, which are found, well, they're found worldwide, but the particular species that it appears to have come from are found in southern China. And so we should be looking there and also trying to understand how the spillover event happened. Did it go direct from bats to people, or did it go via another animal group? And you mentioned pangolins earlier, and there's been a lot of speculation as to whether pangolins were that missing link in the species jump from bats to people. And I think that's still very much open to question now. But I would like to see this critical investigation carried out earlier rather than later, because obviously the longer you leave it, the colder the trail will go. So I know China has said that while they're happy to cooperate with an independent investigation into the causes, they are planning to wait until the pandemic is over. Well, that could be still some way off.
Yeah, it certainly looks like it where we're sitting right now. Because am I speaking to you? You're in England.
Yes.
Yeah, so you've just gone back into lockdown. We're slightly behind you in Scotland here. We're not quite back into full full lockdown yet. But hopefully we're going to see an end to this at some point. Maybe 2021 by the look of it right now. But yeah, it's a very, very serious topic, and I think it's completely understandable that kind of knee-jerk reaction to this disease has come from wild sources, spilled over into humans, and has shut the world down. So it's understandable why there might be a reaction to say, let's shut the global trade in wildlife. But I think that there's probably a very poor understanding from your average member of the public about just how much trade there is. And like we said kind of at the start of the podcast, most people associate that with animals, but the plant trade is far, far bigger, and we rely on it.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We rely on it, yeah.
I wanted to ask you specifically about two reports that have been done quite recently. One, which I was just reading prior to us jumping on a call and recording this podcast, about the tiger trade, which I was shocked to find how much or how many tigers are traded across the European Union and the UK. And it being potentially used as a cover for illegal trade. Just talk me through that investigation and the reporting and some of these numbers.
Sure. So tigers are phenomenally easy to breed in captivity. And I'm sure...
Yeah, so much so there's more tigers in captivity than in the wild.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the world's wild tiger population, which is obviously all in Asia, is around the 3,500 figure. But there's more than that in the USA, and there's more than that in China, in captive facilities. And indeed, the European Union has an unknown number. It's not as high as those, but it's certainly in the hundreds of animals. And it's actually quite extraordinary how little regulation and oversight of some of the trade there is. And we've seen in recent years that was spoken about in the report you referred to, the close ties between the Czech Republic and Vietnam, their historical political ties, and the Vietnamese community there being engaged in trafficking tiger parts from the Czech Republic to Vietnam to supply demand there. Again, it's demand that's driving that trade. But even the United Kingdom's been involved in exports of tigers. There's been a number of examples documented in the report. Some of this is related to the zoo community. There's also some of the trade is associated with circuses and so on. But it is quite extraordinary how many tigers there are living outside the wild around the world.
Yeah. So just to back up, and the trade that's happening, say to take the example of the however many, I think it's a relatively small number, but still a surprising number of tigers that are traded out of the UK to other parts of the world. That is done legally and is permitted because these are captive tigers, but it's also being used as a cover for the illegal trade in wild tigers, or just an illegal trade in tiger parts that shouldn't be allowed under these circumstances?
It's mainly used, or mainly it's legal. So there is a proper certificated CITES certificate that allows trade under particular circumstances, and that's all above board. But yes, there is an element of some trade being carried out that is illegal of tiger parts. So particularly bones are in demand for making tiger bone glue and tiger bone wine and other products. And that trade without the permits is illegal. There's also, various national legislation that restricts the keeping of tigers. I mean, in the UK, we've got the Dangerous Wild Animals Act that means that private owners of tigers at least have to register them. And I understand there are some animals registered thus in the UK, but they're far from common. In Asia, we do see a lot more examples where captive tigers are used. Well, they're both in trade, which is illegal. There's no permit system, and it's banned by CITES. And we see something like 2 tigers a week being seized, the equivalent of in Asia. But there is some element of it that is also being used to traffic parts of wild tigers, and obviously that's having a direct impact on wild populations. So Malaysia, Peninsular Malaysia in particular, is got a rapidly depleting tiger population, and it's almost entirely because of poaching and illegal trade in those animals rather than habitat loss.
This brings up an interesting question, which often gets brought up when it comes to the ivory trade, which is that when there has been in the past a legal trade with CITES permits involved, that it's been used as a cover for the illegal poaching and trade of ivory. And this sounds like a kind of, it's a smaller, but a similar example. Like how do we reconcile this, where we have a species where there is a legal and an illegal component of it? And it may very well be the case that the legal component of it allows the illegal component to be masked and hidden in a way, and these products to be traded under a legal banner, but with various loopholes and with the genius that's involved in criminal activities and the way that they manage to transport things around the planet. And they're using this to facilitate illegal trade.
Well, I think this is a very significant issue and it comes down to how well you monitor and regulate and have oversight of that legal trade, because it's not just commodities like ivory where that's the case. One of the biggest, or perhaps the most significant issue facing illegal trade coming into the EU of species like reptiles is the laundering of wild caught animals and simply declaring them as being captive bred, because there's different rules that apply to captive bred specimens under CITES. And basically, um, animals and animal products are labelled as being captive bred, and once inside the EU, of course, with the open border system, they can be moved within EU countries without fear of interdiction. It's once they're beyond that border crossing. So it is absolutely a critical issue that needs to be understood and measures put in place to try and prevent illegal trade taking place under the cover of legal trade, and to ensure that any legal trade is just that.
Is there maybe scope for using some advanced technology and science that we have now, like DNA barcoding?
Yes, I mean, obviously there's a number of scientific developments that are proving very valuable in helping with this oversight and monitoring. DNA is an obvious one, forensic techniques. But one of the key issues, actually, that a lot of enforcement agencies and customs officers face is simply species identification. That actually, for non-specialists, it's actually quite hard to know what's being put in front of you is what it says it is.
Yeah, very true.
But there are, here again, there are assistance is available. So we're seeing things like technology, recognition technology comes into play, and actually one of the really powerful ways in which you can help to monitor and look for contraband in trade is to use specially trained dogs, detector dogs, and they're actually remarkable for being able to sniff out illegal contraband that they've been taught to identify, even down to the level of different species of timber. Would you believe?
That's incredible.
Yeah,
From drugs to the to illegal trade of different species of timber, dogs'
yeah,
noses, remarkable.
they're remarkable
Um,
animals. Yeah.
They really are. That's fascinating. There's two other things I wanted to ask you about. I want to get on to the recent report called Beyond Poaching. But before that, as you were talking there, I was thinking about this balance between legal and illegal trade, and I was immediately thinking about the abalone trade, particularly in South Africa, and its connection with criminal networks. I know a little bit about it just because I spend quite a lot of time there, but outside of South Africa and certainly outside of the continent of Africa, I think that'll be something that few people are probably aware of.
Yeah, so abalone is a kind of marine mollusk, and the particular species that's in very, very high demand in East Asia, particularly Hong Kong and mainland China, is only found in waters off South Africa. And basically, there's a legal fishery for that abalone, but the offtake from illegal fishing is far, far higher, and abalone is basically paid for by drugs. So a lot of the divers who are going down and fishing out abalone from the seas are paid with things like crystal meth. And the control of that trade is in the hands of the so-called Hong Kong triads, who both control that drug supply and import the abalone into Hong Kong from where it's onward distributed. And it obviously creates huge enforcement challenges. I mean, every night you've got so-called rubber duck boats, big inflatable boats going out along the shoreline of large areas of South Africa, particularly the Western Cape and other regions, with teams of divers on whose role is to dive down, bring up as much abalone as they can, and then from there it will be driven to a processing center where it's dried because it's a lot lighter and easier to conceal, dried abalone, before it is then smuggled by a number of techniques, but from there it is smuggled to particularly Hong Kong, and it's one of the key sort of products that's coming out of that region that we've been looking at to try and understand the dynamics of both that trade, but also the impacts this criminalization has on local communities, that they're reliant on. Well, a lot of the people within it are now drug dependent, and they're reliant on the income and source of employment that smuggling and poaching abalone brings, and it's a very sad situation.
The connections with the criminal networks, particularly in that case, where there's this, like, for the smugglers, it's a perfect cycle of drug addiction, but not so much for people to come back and buy drugs, which is the normal link that they would have, but so that they're dependent on the smugglers for the drugs, so that they'll go and poach the abalone, which has a higher value for them. And I know that this is something that's been escalating for some time. I would imagine that this is starting to have a real impact on abalone themselves as an actual commodity and the abundance of them.
Oh, yes. I mean, abalone populations are under very, very severe harvesting pressure and are declining. I mean, um, it can't carry on for much longer at the current rates of illegal offtake, and the ultimately that source of supply will dwindle away to nothing.
What is, just finally on this topic, I mean, what is being done to try and stop this and slow it down?
Well, a lot of the response, of course, has been enforcement. So enforcement efforts have been stepped up to try and uh, interdict these rubber duck boats that are going out with the teams of divers. But that's not addressing the root problem. Again, ultimately, it's the demand at the consumer end that is actually driving this. And that if there is going to be a long-term solution to this, you need to break that cycle. You either have to um, convince consumers not to eat abalone, or perhaps an easier sell is to convince consumers only to buy certified or fresh abalone, because by and large you can be pretty sure that any dried abalone for sale in Hong Kong is illegally sourced, whereas fresh abalone, uh, it's not as an attractive a commodity for the smugglers, because it smells more, it's easier to detect, it weighs more, so it's more costly to transport. that is likely to be from a legal source. So if you can try and shift consumers from dried abalone to fresh abalone, that would be a step. Ultimately, if you're going to break that cycle, you need to really substantially reduce the demand in the first place. But then, of course, you've got to back up with what's going to happen to these communities in South Africa and the drug dependency. And so you need rehabilitation measures, and ultimately, you need alternative legal, economic means of support. That if people have got economic opportunities, they won't get drawn into this criminal underworld.
Yeah, I think that goes a lot to, or it speaks a lot to the issues globally we have with illegal trade. Is really it boils down to economic opportunity of very poor communities. And if there is economic opportunity to make a living, and that happens to be an illegal trade of timber or wildlife, then people are going to do it because that's how they put food in their mouths. And that's kind of a perfect segue into the last thing I wanted to ask you about, which is this report called Beyond the Poaching, where Traffic have taken a very novel approach where they've actually gone and taken the time to interview poachers, but to try and understand the actual socioeconomic impacts and really get to the root cause of the reasons why people are poaching. How did that report come about, and what has been the outcome of it?
Well, the study came about because, as you point out, we wanted to try and understand what really motivates people to become involved in wildlife crime. And so we approached the South African prison service, and they gave us permission to, under carefully controlled conditions and so on, to interview um, volunteers who had been incarcerated for wildlife crimes, um, and to carry out semi-structured interviews to try and understand what really got them, to where they were. How come they'd ended up behind bars, and I find it quite heartbreaking. Some of the stories. I mean, we touched on the economic opportunities, and by far and away, the commonest reason people were there was simply because lack of job, lack of opportunity. They saw others who they knew were involved in poaching, driving fast cars, and they wanted to get some money to feed their families and so on. And with 100%, all of the people we interviewed said they, really regretted what they'd done and how they'd ended up where they were. But I think there was a really interesting finding that of those people who were jailed, very, very few were anything other than the very lowest rung in the criminal ladder. These were all the poachers or the drivers, people who were actually orchestrating the crime, who were making the profits. They weren't behind bars, and I think it really highlights the need that if you are to address organised criminal activity, you really do need to get high up that criminal ladder and try and get the guys at the top, because the bottom rung are replaceable. That you can lock up N poachers, but there'll always be others to fill their place.
Yeah, there's always desperate people out there.
There's always desperate people out there. So really, the long-term solution are economic ones, that you need to give people real meaning, life, and economic opportunities in life. If you're to try and curb these sort of activities at that level.
It's a fascinating piece of research that's been done. And like I said, something which I hadn't really seen done before like that. The first thing that it made me think of when I was reading through the report was that series that was, I can't actually remember what it was called now. But it was based on a real life example in the CIA, where they started actually interviewing serial killers to try and understand their mindset, and so that they could more easily catch and stop serial killers in the future. And in a way, that's kind of what's being done here. This is trying to understand the mindset of a poacher so that we can break the cycle. So I thought it was a really interesting approach to actually take the time to speak to people in a constructive way, who have been caught and convicted of these wildlife crimes. But as you point out, it is very easy by comparison to catching the networks that are making this global illegal trade possible. It's very easy to catch the person on the ground who's doing the initial capture of pangolins, or the initial poaching of ivory or timber, but actually trying to get higher up that chain of command to the people who are really pulling or making the wheels turn. That's how you can, in the shorter term, that's how you can reduce this trade. But in the longer term, we need to look at the economics of it, and the sort of social infrastructure, so that those incentives aren't there.
Yeah, and indeed, as I mentioned earlier, the demand, because ultimately it is the
Of
demand
course.
that
Yeah.
fuels any trade. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if as long as there is a demand and no supply, the price will continue going up until that supply is fulfilled, and that's just basic economics.
Yeah. And we have a whole program of work trying to reduce demand in this particular example. Very relevant would be for rhino horn. So working with Vietnamese consumers. So we actually interviewed consumers of rhino horn to try and understand what motivated them, why they were using it, what drove them to do that. And then we tried to use that information to come up with messaging to persuade them not to.
That's really key.
Journey. Yeah.
But that kind of almost, I want to say, re-education process, but there's that education process, I suppose, is something which is long fought. You can't do that overnight. I mean, that takes a generation or two to really, for you to be able to start to see the results of it.
Yes, it's very much a long-term solution, and it's actually been a fascinating journey for me, just trying to understand some of the simple misconceptions that you might have about how to go about something like this. So I think Traffic, like many other NGOs, thought, well, if you want to stop people using rhino horn, show them a big picture of a rhino and say, why would you want to kill this? And actually that's completely the wrong message to give to users, because they just see a big animal and they think, gosh, I want a piece of that. So and similarly, putting your logo on materials. I mean, every NGO wants to be seen to be doing what it is and slaps its logo on everything wherever possible. But actually, to the users, they just say, "Well, you're paid to say things like this. I can see because your logo's on it."
Yeah, it's a good point, actually.
Two early lessons that we got from some of that feedback.
So that's why you don't have a logo other than the name.
That's one of the reasons we don't have any logo on our material. That's trying to persuade rhino horn consumers to not to use rhino horn in Vietnam.
Richard, this has been a fascinating conversation, and one that is just so very important. This very intricate web of global trade of wildlife products. I mean, we could talk for hours more on it, and I encourage people to visit the Traffic website, which is just traffic.org, and have a look at some of the information and content that's on there. because you do it. I think the organization does a really great job of making it quite consumable, even in these reports, with very easy and clear graphics. So you can get a real good handle on global trade and the issues that we face pretty quickly just by having a look at some of your reports. But I really thank you for your time today, and I look forward to seeing what else comes out of the traffic reports going forward. It's always something that I look with interest to when new information comes out. And I'd also like to just direct people to. I noticed that you've got a channel on Vimeo with some really quite intriguing, but frightening in many ways videos on there. The one that I just watched and we haven't talked about, but people can go and watch it, was on the shark trade out of Congo Brazzaville.
Yeah, absolutely. We do try and make all our resources freely available, so all our reports can be downloaded as PDFs from the website. And as you mentioned, we've got Vimeo channel, and of course, do follow us on Twitter.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.